The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 20, The Discipline of Conscious Living. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. This is the final episode in the series. Across these episodes, we have explored consciousness not as an abstract mystery alone, but as something lived through the body, through attention, through language, through relationship, through emotional atmosphere, through identity, through collective fields, and through the subtle architecture of everyday life. We have moved through the body before thought, emotional hijacking, dissociation, flow states, attention, manipulation, language, narrative, mirror systems, collective consciousness, autopilot, and the difficult but practical work of noticing loops before they fully take over. And if the previous episode turned that understanding toward interruption, toward the moment where awareness begins to return inside repetition, then this final episode asks a larger and quieter question. What does it actually mean to live consciously? Not as a concept, not as a persona, not as a dramatic peak state, not as an identity built around being more aware than other people, but as a way of living that remains possible after the insight fades, after the emotional clarity passes, after the breakthrough loses its glow, and ordinary life returns with all its demands, habit preppers, relationships, distractions, and unfinished loops. Because this is where many people get lost. They have moments of insight, genuine ones. They see something clearly. They understand the pattern. They feel the truth of it in the body. They have a season of expansion, honesty, or deeper presence. But then life continues. Stress returns. Old habits reappear. Attention drifts. The body tightens again. The same relational roles begin knocking at the door. And if the person has unconsciously turned consciousness into an ideal of arrival, they often interpret this return to ordinary human reality as failure. But conscious living is not something you arrive at once. That is one of the most important truths of this final episode. Awareness is not a permanent energetic condition you achieve and then possess forever. It is not a badge, not a final platform of identity, not proof that you have transcended drift, reaction, memory, social influence, or emotional patterning. Even people with deep insight still forget, still tighten, still disappear into old loops, still get activated, still go unconscious in moments, still lost contact, still need to return. The question is not whether you ever leave awareness. The question is how you return when you do. And that changes the entire tone of the work. Because if consciousness is dynamic rather than fixed, then mature practice is not about maintaining a permanent state of wakefulness. It is about becoming more honest, more embodied, more responsible, and more available to repeated return. It is about building a life in which the conditions of awareness are cared for often enough that contact becomes easier to restore, not permanently held, restored. So this final episode is about discipline, but not discipline in the harsh, punishing, performative sense people often associate with the word, not severity, not rigid self-management, not becoming spiritually impressive. Discipline here means something quieter and more human. It means rhythmic return. It means daily stewardship. It means coming back to body, to awareness, to language, to truthfulness, to internal reference, to the present, again and again, without making a religion out of perfection. This matters because many people admire awareness without practicing it. They collect insight. They understand the framework. They can speak intelligently about nervous systems, subconscious patterns, attention capture, trauma loops, identity structures, and relational fields. But understanding is not the same as embodiment. Knowing is not the same as living. A person can explain everything and still be ruled by old sequencing under pressure. They can describe the map beautifully and still vanish the moment the field tightens. And this is not hypocrisy. It is simply proof that insight without repetition fades. Awareness must be practiced rather than admired. That is the central shift. And that practice does not usually look dramatic. It looks ordinary. It looks like noticing your state before replying, feeling the body before the story completes itself, returning to the breath when urgency begins to organize interpretation, recognizing the old role before speaking from it, catching tone before it becomes a weapon, protecting attention from needless fragmentation, letting uncertainty remain open a little longer, telling the truth more accurately, apologizing more honestly, pausing without theatrics, returning without self-punishment, becoming less colonizing to yourself and others, because your awareness is no longer so easily hijacked by the unexamined state. That is where the real work lives. So in this final episode, we begin by dismantling one of the most common fantasies in consciousness work, the fantasy of permanent awakening. The fantasy that awareness is something you attain once, hold indefinitely, and display through your consistency, your calm, your language, your identity, or your self-image. It is not. Consciousness moves. Human beings drift. Attention gets captured. Old patterns return. Fields exert pressure. Life becomes noisy. The body gets tired. The nervous system gets overwhelmed. Insight fades if it is not revisited. And that does not mean the work failed. It means the work is alive. So the purpose of this opening is to set a mature tone for the ending of the series. Not the tone of climax, superiority, or final arrival, but of humility, of practice, of sustained return. Because if there is one thing I want this final episode to leave behind, it is this. Conscious living is not a permanent state. It is a discipline of return. Part 1. Conscious living is not a permanent state. One of the most subtle distortions in any work around awareness, healing, spirituality, psychology, or consciousness is the fantasy of arrival. The idea that there is some point at which the work will complete itself, and a person will step into a more final condition, a stable awakened self, a permanently regulated mind, a version of life where old loops no longer return, emotional weather no longer changes, triggers no longer touch the body, distractions no longer pull attention, and insight remains available on demand. It is an understandable fantasy. In some ways, it is even an innocent one. People long for relief, they long for coherence, they long for the end of internal contradiction, repeated suffering, and unconscious repetition. So when they first begin experiencing deeper awareness, it can be tempting to imagine that what they are touching is a destination rather than a state of greater contact. But conscious living is not a permanent state. Awareness is not something you arrive at once and then keep forever. Even people with real depth still drift. They still react, they still forget. They still lose themselves for a while inside old narratives, emotional climates, relational roles, defensive habits, and familiar forms of automaticity. They may do so less totally, less often, less unconsciously, but they still do it. Why? Because consciousness is dynamic, not fixed. It moves with the state. It moves with the body. It moves with pressure, capacity, fatigue, context, memory, and field. It is alive, not static. That matters because many people quietly turn their best moments into standards they then use against themselves later. They have an experience of clarity, openness, courage, deep self-contact, or unusual regulation, and instead of receiving it as a glimpse, a practice, or a state of greater availability, they interpret it as proof of who they now ought to be all the time. Then life does what life always does. It keeps moving. Stress returns. A relational field tightens. The body becomes tired. Attention gets captured. An old pattern reactivates. And the person suddenly feels they have fallen from something they were supposed to have become permanently. But drift is part of being human. That sentence should not be used to excuse unconscious living, but it must be understood if the work is to remain sane. Drift happens. You wake in an old state. You lose an hour online. You become sharp in a conversation before you notice your tone. You fall back into an identity groove. You start performing in a field that asks for performance. You repeat the old internal story. You forget the body. You lose contact. You come back later. None of that proves consciousness failed. It proves consciousness needs practice. This is why being conscious cannot be reduced to mood, persona, or performance. Some people unconsciously build an identity around awareness. They become the reflective one, the regulated one, the spiritual one, the insightful one, the awake one. But once consciousness becomes a badge, it is already being distorted. Why? Because now awareness is being used as identity furniture rather than lived as practice. The person becomes invested in appearing conscious rather than returning honestly when they are not. They become attached to the idea of themselves as aware, and that attachment often makes real self-observation harder, not easier. A mature consciousness is not obsessed with proving itself. It does not need to look permanently calm. It does not need to seem above ordinary struggle. It does not need to hold a constant energetic glow. It does not need to eliminate all drift to be real. In many cases, the most conscious person in the room is not the one who seems most polished. It is the one who can notice when they have lost contact and return without drama, superiority, or self-condemnation. That is the real work. The real work begins when the high of insight fades and life continues. That is where most teachings become either useful or performative. Because in the moment of breakthrough, almost everything can feel obvious. The pattern is visible, the body is open, the truth is alive, the words come easily. But what happens 2 days later? Or in traffic? Or in conflict? Or in grief? Or after poor sleep? Or under social pressure? Or when the old chemistry returns? Or when the field gets crowded? Or when silence becomes uncomfortable again? That is where conscious living becomes real. Not in the extraordinary moment alone, but in the ordinary moment after it. So if there is a mature framing for the end of this series, it might begin here. The question is not whether you ever leave awareness. You will. The question is how you return. Do you notice sooner? Do you come back with more honesty? Do you protect the conditions that make awareness more available? Do you stop demanding permanent awakening and begin practicing rhythmic return? Because that is what a living consciousness asks for, not admiration, not identity, not theatrical enlightenment. Practice, repetition, humility, ongoing care. And once that is understood, the next question becomes the practical heart of the whole episode. Why must awareness be practiced rather than merely understood? That is where we move next. Part 2. Why awareness must be practiced. If the first part of this episode dismantled the fantasy of permanent awakening, then this part establishes the practical heart of everything that follows. Awareness must be practiced, not admired, not merely understood, not collected as a set of insights, practiced. This matters because many people mistake clarity for change. They have a powerful realization. They understand the pattern. They can describe the architecture beautifully. They see how attention gets captured, how the nervous system moves before thought, how language shapes the field, how old loops repeat, how identity stabilizes around story, how collective atmospheres alter perception. The understanding may be genuine, even profound, but then ordinary life resumes, and much of the old behavior returns with surprising speed. The person becomes confused. But I know this. I've already seen this. Why am I still doing it? Because insight without repetition fades. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply how human embodiment works. A person can understand something deeply and still not live from it consistently, because understanding does not automatically reorganize the body, the nervous system, attention, relational habits, or the timing of reaction. A realized truth may be real, but if it is not revisited often enough to enter the structures of daily life, it remains more available in reflective moments than in pressured ones. This is one reason people can understand everything and still repeat old behavior. They know what their childhood pattern is. They know the attachment dynamic. They know the trigger. They know the emotional sequence. They know the cognitive distortion. They know the story. They know the practice that would help, and yet when the right cue appears, the old behavior still runs. This is not because knowledge is useless. It is because knowledge and embodiment are not identical. A person can know they over-explain when they feel unsafe, and still begin over-explaining the moment their nervous system reads threat. A person can know that doom-scrolling dysregulates them, and still reach for the phone when presence becomes difficult. A person can know that their morning dread is a familiar state, not the full truth of the day, and still wake into it bodily before any wiser framing has had time to arrive. A person can know that urgency narrows perception and still be overtaken by urgency under pressure. The body learns through repetition. The nervous system learns through repetition. Attention is strengthened through repetition. That means awareness must also be repeated if it is going to become more available than the old sequence. This is why breakthrough moments are not enough. Breakthroughs matter. They can be real turning points. They can show a person what is possible. They can reveal a pattern that had remained hidden for years. They can give language to something previously lived only as confusion. They can create a moment of profound contact in which the person finally sees themselves, their history, their relationships, or their behavior with greater clarity. Those moments should not be dismissed. But a breakthrough is not the same thing as practice. A breakthrough shows. Practice stabilizes. A breakthrough reveals. Practice returns. A breakthrough opens the field. Practice learns how to remain in a relationship with that opening after the moment has passed. Without practice, a breakthrough often becomes memory. Inspiring, moving, maybe even life-changing in one sense, but still not strong enough to withstand the ordinary pressures of fatigue, conflict, noise, distraction, social fields, and old conditioning. The person remembers the insight, sometimes lovingly, sometimes bitterly, but still cannot access it when it matters most. That gap between vision and embodiment is where many people quietly lose heart. And this is where one of the most important distinctions of the entire episode comes in. The gap between I know and I live it. I know belongs mostly to cognition. It means the map is there, the explanation exists, the person has understanding. They may even have a very refined understanding. But I live it means the understanding has been revisited enough, practiced enough, and embodied enough that it begins shaping actual participation. Not perfectly, not continuously, but reliably enough that it can influence behavior in ordinary moments. That difference is enormous. A person may know that tone matters in communication, but do they notice their own tone shifting under activation? A person may know that collective fields shape perception, but do they catch themselves becoming performative in the crowd? A person may know they disappear into a familiar role in conflict, but do they feel it while it is beginning? A person may know attention is fragile, but do they protect it in the first 10 minutes after waking? A person may know their self-talk is inherited from older verbal atmospheres, but do they hear the harshness while it is forming? That is the difference between collected insight and practiced awareness. This is why the nervous system learns through repeated experience rather than occasional inspiration. A person does not become more regulated because they once understood regulation beautifully. They become more regulated because over time they keep returning to the conditions that support contact: breath, body, pause, honesty, naming, pacing, attention, reflection, less fragmentation, cleaner language, better boundaries, and more reality-based repetition. Likewise, a person does not become more conscious simply because they had one profound moment. They become more conscious because they keep coming back. Attention itself works this way. Attention is not strengthened by agreement with an idea. It is strengthened by return. Every time someone notices they have drifted and comes back, something is being trained. Not always dramatically, sometimes almost invisibly, but the repeated return matters. The mind wanders, the person comes back. The loop begins, the person notices. The body tightens and the person feels it. The story starts running and the person pauses. They do not need to win every time for the practice to be real. The return is the practice. That is why conscious living requires rhythm, not inspiration. Inspiration is unstable. It rises, falls, glows, fades. It may help begin the work, but it cannot carry the whole life. Rhythm is different. Rhythm means there are repeated ways of returning that do not depend on being in the mood, being at your best, or being flooded with insight. It means consciousness is not treated like a special event. It becomes part of ordinary participation. That may look like very small things. Feeling the breath before replying, checking the state of the body when waking, pausing before opening the app, naming activation in conflict, letting the body register the room before absorbing its atmosphere, returning to internal reference after social performance, noticing when old self-talk has begun, protecting a little space in the day where the mind is not constantly captured, orienting before difficult conversations, ending the day by recognizing which field you lived in. None of those things is spectacular, but they are how awareness becomes lived rather than admired. This is also why ordinary moments matter more than many people realize. People often imagine practice must happen in special spaces, on retreat, in journals, in therapy rooms, during exceptional states of honesty, at times of profound reflection. Those spaces matter, but a conscious life is built in ordinary moments, in kitchens, in cars, in messages, in meetings, in silences, in pauses, in the first reactions, in the moment before the old role takes over, in the morning before the emotional climate hardens, in the small return rather than the dramatic reinvention. This is how awareness becomes practice through repetition in ordinary life, not by becoming impressive, not by turning consciousness into an image, but by revisiting it often enough. It starts affecting participation. That brings us to the core insight of the whole section. Awareness becomes real when it is revisited often enough to shape participation. That is the threshold. Not when you can explain it beautifully, not when you have once felt it intensely, not when you have made it part of your identity, but when it begins changing how you enter conversations, mornings, reactions, choices, speech, attention, and return. Once that is understood, the next question becomes even more practical. If awareness must be practiced, then what exactly is being practiced every day? What are the core conditions that need stewardship if consciousness is to remain more available in ordinary life? That takes us back to the architecture of the whole series: body, subconscious patterning, and attention. That is where we move next. Part 3. The body, subconscious, and attention in daily discipline. If awareness must be practiced rather than merely admired, then the question becomes, what exactly is being practiced? What are we actually returning to, caring for, and working with in daily life? Because if consciousness is not a permanent mood and not a fixed achievement, then conscious living cannot mean simply thinking better thoughts or collecting wiser interpretations. It has to involve the conditions that shape awareness before and beneath thought. That brings us back to the core architecture of the whole series: the body, the subconscious, and attention. These are not separate in any absolute sense. They are deeply entangled. The body affects what is thinkable. The subconscious affects what feels familiar, threatening, or emotionally convincing. Attention affects what becomes real, salient, or central in a given moment. If any of these are neglected, awareness becomes less stable, less available, and more easily captured. So discipline, in the mature sense, means working with all three layers, not trying to overpower them cognitively, not trying to dominate life through insight alone, but learning how to care for the conditions in which awareness can remain more available. That is why a conscious life is built through repeated care for the conditions that shape awareness, not through one breakthrough, not through one beautiful idea, not through one emotionally vivid moment of honesty, but through repeated relationship to body, subconscious patterning, and attention. The body needs regulation, not neglect. The body is often where the real work either begins or gets bypassed. Many people try to live consciously while remaining largely estranged from their own physiological condition. They think of consciousness as something that happens mostly in the mind, then wonder why their best insights vanish under pressure. But if the body is dysregulated, chronically overstimulated, shut down, exhausted, unfelt, or ignored, then awareness is already being constrained before the person has even begun reflecting. This is why the body needs regulation, not neglect. Regulation does not mean making the body calm all the time. It means learning how to remain in a relationship with the state, how to know when the system is speeding up, going flat, becoming fragmented, tightening around threat, slipping into fog, or losing the capacity for reflection. Most people have been taught either to obey the body blindly or ignore it until it starts causing visible problems. Neither is enough. The conscious path asks for literacy. One of the most basic entry points is breath. Breath matters because it is one of the fastest ways the body tells the truth about its state. You may still be saying, "I'm fine," but the breath has already shortened. You may still be trying to explain something clearly, but the breath is already stuck high in the chest. You may still believe you are simply focused, but the breath is really signaling strain, urgency, or low-grade threat activation. Breath is not a cure-all, it is a signal. It tells you what state is organizing awareness. That is why simple breath awareness remains so powerful. Not because breathing is some miracle technique that solves everything, but because it interrupts estrangement. It returns the person to the actual conditions of consciousness in the moment. If the breath is tight, held, rushed, or barely noticed, that matters. If slowing it slightly changes the whole field, that matters too. A conscious life often includes repeated returns to the breath, not because the practice is glamorous, but because it is real. Grounding matters for similar reasons. Grounding is not only a therapeutic buzzword. In practical terms, it means helping the body register that it is here, now in this environment, with these actual conditions, rather than fully organized around remembered threat, anticipated collapse, or abstract mental weather. The person feels their feet, notices the chair, let the eyes widen, name what is physically present, feels the contact points of the body with the world. This may sound simple, and it is. But simplicity is not the same as insignificance. Many people live most of the day slightly ungrounded, mentally elsewhere, bodily braced, emotionally recruited by stories, devices, tasks, or anticipatory states. Grounding returns some of that scattered energy to the present field. Orientation is another underrated discipline. Orientation means allowing the body to look around, register where it is, and take in enough of the environment that the nervous system can stop behaving as though only the feared object exists. In dysregulated states, attention narrows quickly. The body locks onto the problem, the threat, the unresolved message, the conflict cue, the imagined future, the remembered pain. Orientation widens the field again. It says, yes, that thing is here, but it is not the whole world. The room exists. The light exists. Other objects exist. The present is larger than the trigger. That shift can be subtle, but it can restore enough space for consciousness to return. This is why state literacy is so important. A conscious person is not necessarily the one who is always calm. They are often the ones who can recognize the state more honestly. They know what urgency feels like in their body, what collapse feels like, what performative activation feels like. What does freezing feel like? What dissociation, flattening, shame, overdrive, hyperfocus, or emotional flooding feels like? Without that literacy, a person keeps mistaking the state for truth. They think this is what's real, when often what is real has already been filtered through a highly specific bodily condition. So, daily discipline with the body may look very ordinary. Noticing the breath before answering, feeling the feet during conflict, standing up before disappearing into a screen spiral, widening the eyes when the mind narrows, naming activation before calling it clarity, recognizing that exhaustion is not only a mood, but a condition affecting thought. Understanding that underslept, undernourished, overstimulated, socially overloaded systems do not produce the same quality of consciousness as more regulated ones. None of this is theatrical. That is precisely why it matters. The subconscious needs observation, not blind obedience. If the body is one major condition of consciousness, the subconscious is another. Much of what people call intuition, instinct, truth, or personality is partly shaped by subconscious patterning, old emotional loops, familiar roles, stored meanings, attachment expectations, protective strategies, repeated interpretations, and rehearsed identities. The subconscious is not the enemy. It contains memory, pattern recognition, procedural learning, emotional intelligence, and enormous organizing power. But if it is obeyed blindly, it often keeps a person inside old architecture while convincing them that the architecture is simply reality. So the subconscious needs observation, not blind obedience. This is where pattern recognition becomes central. If the same emotional loop keeps appearing, if the same type of person keeps activating the same role, if the same relational chemistry keeps producing the same collapse, if the same story keeps returning under pressure, then the subconscious is speaking in repetition. It is not enough to be impressed by the repetition or demoralized by it. The mature task is to observe it. Which roles keep returning? The appeaser, the attacker, the caretaker, the invisible one, the one who becomes hypercompetent, the one who stays vague, the one who always needs to explain, the one who goes cold rather than exposed. These are not just habits. They are often subconscious positions the person learned to occupy, because those positions once preserved safety, belonging, coherence, or dignity. Recurring emotional loops matter too. A person may repeatedly move from uncertainty into urgency, or from loneliness into compulsive checking, or from shame into collapse, or from relational distance into protest behavior, or from boredom into distraction, or from conflict into old identity stories. Once these loops are recognized as loops, the person gains a different relationship to them. They stop being merely how I am and start becoming part of a discernible sequence. This is why observation matters more than blind obedience. Blind obedience sounds like this: I feel it, so it must be true. I'm drawn to it, so it must be right. This feels familiar, so it must be me. I'm certain, therefore I'm clear, and that role is coming online, so I guess that's just who I am. Observation sounds different. This is familiar. This feels convincing, but it may be patterned. This role is active again. I know this sequence. My system expects this here. This may be intuition, but it may also be history. That observational stance does not deny the subconscious. It studies it. It takes it seriously enough not to submit to it automatically. This is important in relationships because the subconscious often confuses familiarity with fit. A person may feel intensely drawn to a dynamic that repeats old emotional architecture and then call that draw chemistry or truth. Another person may feel strangely uncomfortable with steadiness because steadiness does not match what the subconscious has learned to expect. Without observation, people keep re-entering the same fields while calling them destiny. With observation, they can begin distinguishing resonance from repetition. This is also where self-story matters. The subconscious often stabilizes identity through repeated narratives. I'm too much. I'm not enough. I'm the one who keeps things together. I'm the one who gets left. I always mess this up. I can't handle conflict. I'm only safe if I'm useful. These stories may not always be consciously chosen, but they shape participation. Observation makes them visible. Blind obedience turns them into fate. So daily discipline with the subconscious may look like noticing the same story appearing under pressure, tracking which role comes online around which people, recognizing the emotional grooves that make certain interpretations feel inevitable, seeing when old chemistry is being mistaken for the present truth, writing down recurring patterns instead of merely drowning in them, learning the sequence, cue, state, thought, behavior, aftermath. The subconscious does not need contempt. It needs light. Attention needs stewardship, not surrender. If the body shapes state and the subconscious shapes interpretation, then attention determines what becomes foreground. And in modern life, attention is perhaps the most continuously violated and least consciously stewarded of the three. Attention is not just a mental spotlight. It is one of the primary organizers of lived reality. What you attend to becomes the world you are inhabiting in that moment. If your attention is constantly captured, fragmented, recruited, overloaded, or surrendered, then consciousness itself becomes less self-directed. You may still be thinking, but you are thinking inside fields someone or something else is largely organizing. That is why attention needs stewardship, not surrender. Most people surrender attention more often than they realize. They wake and immediately hand it to the device. They enter a room and immediately hand it to the atmosphere. They feel discomfort and hand it to distraction. They feel uncertainty and resort to repetitive checking. They feel emptiness and hand it to noise. They feel activation and hand it to speed. They live inside borrowed focus fields and then wonder why they cannot hear themselves clearly. Stewardship means becoming more intentional about what gets access to your awareness, when and under what conditions. This is not about obsessive control. It is about care. Reducing capture is part of that care. Certain conditions reliably capture attention. Outrage cycles, symbolic conflict, algorithmic stimulation, repeated checking, emotionally loaded messaging, multitasking, unresolved notifications, environments that train vigilance, and social fields built on speed and urgency. A conscious life does not require total withdrawal from these things, but it does require recognizing what they do. If a person repeatedly allows their attention to be fragmented the moment they wake, to be swallowed whenever discomfort appears, or to be colonized by endless symbolic intensity, then awareness has very little room to stabilize. Practicing return is the second half of stewardship. Attention will drift. That is not failure. The issue is whether it can return. The same is true in meditation, in conversation, in work, in conflict, in ordinary life. The mind goes. The phone calls. The field recruits. The loop begins. Return is the practice. Not permanent control, but repeated reclamation. Protecting the field also matters. This means becoming more careful with the environments in which attention lives. What do you let in first thing? What do you carry all day? What voices, screens, rooms, rhythms, conversations, feeds, and repeated cues are shaping the baseline of your awareness? If the field is constantly crowded, then return becomes harder, not because you lack discipline, but because the conditions are hostile to it. This is why simple practices matter so much. Not opening the phone immediately on waking, pausing before responding, creating device-free moments, allowing silence without rushing to fill it, orienting before entering socially charged environments, ending certain conversations instead of continuing from pure activation, choosing fewer inputs with greater care. None of this is glamorous. Again, that is precisely the point. Conscious life is not built mainly in dramatic moments. It is built in how attention is stewarded repeatedly enough that it stops being surrendered by default. Discipline means working with all three layers. This is where the section gathers into one mature principle. Discipline means working with body, subconscious, and attention together, not trying to overpower them cognitively. That last distinction matters. Many people still try to live consciously by arguing with themselves mentally. They believe enough insight, enough reframing, enough theory, enough logic, enough spiritual understanding, and enough good intentions should be enough to dominate the state. But often it is not. Not because the mind is useless, but because the mind is not the whole ecology of consciousness. A person can know better and still be body activated, subconsciously patterned, and attention captured all at once, which is why daily discipline cannot be only cognitive. It has to ask, what state is the body in? What pattern is the subconscious expecting? Where has attention gone? What is shaping awareness right now, before I finish explaining myself to myself? A conscious life is built through repeated care for these conditions. Not once, not occasionally, repeatedly. Breath, grounding, and orientation for the body. Pattern recognition and role observation for the subconscious. Reduced capture and repeated return for attention. This is what makes the practice real. It stops consciousness from becoming an admired abstraction and turns it into stewardship, a way of caring for the ecology of awareness itself. And once that ecology is being cared for, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do we then do with language, story, and relationship? Because conscious living is not only about the state and attention internally, it also changes how we speak, how we name, how we interpret, and how we affect the fields of others. That is where we move next. Part for language, story, and relational responsibility. If the body, subconscious, and attention shape the inner conditions of awareness, then language shapes how those conditions become organized, interpreted, and shared. And this is where conscious living becomes unmistakably ethical. Because language does not only describe your experience, it helps create the world you and others are then forced to live inside. That is why words are not neutral. They are not neutral in the body. They are not neutral in relationships. They are not neutral in memory. They are not neutral in groups. They are not neutral in the self. A phrase can regulate or compress. A tone can settle or recruit. A repeated story can become identity. A careless label can reduce complexity into fate. A room can become narrower because of the way one person speaks. Or it can become more workable, because someone names what is happening accurately enough that the field starts organizing around truth rather than confusion. So conscious living does not only change how one thinks, it changes how one speaks. This begins with a basic but often neglected point. Language affects the nervous system, not only through overtly dramatic speech, but through ordinary phrasing, repeated tone, timing, implication, and emotional charge. People do not just hear words as abstract content. They receive them through body state, relational history, and field conditions. This means the way you name something can either widen contact with reality or intensify a distorted relationship to it. That is why naming accurately matters. If a person says, "I am broken," they are not merely describing distress. They are creating a reality format around the distress. If they say, "I am activated," that creates a different relationship. If they say, "This is impossible," that shapes attention differently than "This feels overwhelming right now." If they say, "You never listen," that lands differently than "I don't feel received in this moment." Accurate naming does not make life easier in some sentimental way. It makes it more workable because it reduces distortion without denying difficulty. This is especially important because people often keep repeating stories about themselves that once described a moment and later hardened into identity. "I'm bad at relationships. I'm too sensitive. I always ruin things. I'm just an anxious person. I'm not someone who can cope with pressure. I'm the kind of person who needs. I'm always the one who..." These stories often start as interpretations of repeated experience, but over time, they become verbal environments. The person starts living inside the story rather than merely telling it. The subconscious takes instruction from it. The body starts preparing for it. Attention begins selecting evidence that keeps it alive. The story becomes a field. This is why conscious living asks not only, "What am I saying?" but "What world does this sentence create?" Because speech shapes relational fields. The way you speak affects what becomes possible in the room. A person can speak from contact and widen reality, or speak from activation and compress everyone around them into defense. A teacher shapes a classroom with speech. A parent shapes a household with speech. A manager shapes a team with speech. A partner shapes the emotional climate of a relationship with speech. Even inner speech shapes the field of the self. This is not a reason to become frightened of every phrase. It is a reason to become more responsible. And responsibility here means more than politeness. It means becoming less careless with language, because words do not simply pass through space. They carry atmosphere. They stabilize stories. They reinforce roles. They can soothe shame or deepen it. They can clarify or colonize. So one of the most practical disciplines is learning to speak from contact rather than activation. That distinction matters enormously. Speaking from activation means the nervous system is already moving too fast, and language is being used to discharge state, secure safety, prove something, dominate the field, avoid vulnerability, or escape discomfort. The words may still sound intelligent, even mature, but the field they carry is compressed. Speaking from contact means there is enough awareness present that your words remain joined to reality, rather than only to your internal momentum. You may still be upset. You may still be uncertain. You may still need to say something difficult, but you are speaking with at least some relationship to the field rather than simply pushing your state through it. This also means noticing when the story is replacing reality. A lot of speech sounds like truth because it is familiar, not because it is accurate. A person says, "This always happens," when they mean "This feels painfully familiar." Or "You don't care," when they mean "I don't feel safe enough right now to interpret this generously." Or "I'm just not good at this," when they mean something old in me has been activated and I'm starting to speak from its logic. Conscious living does not require sterile language, but it does ask for more honest language, less dramatic certainty, more accurate contact. Tone and timing matter here too. You can say something true in a way that the other person cannot receive because your timing is wrong, your tone is carrying a threat, or your urgency has overtaken your contact. Conscious speech means taking some responsibility, not only for the correctness of your point, but for the emotional field your way of speaking is producing. That does not mean you are responsible for other people's reactions in a total sense. It means you are responsible for whether your speech is needlessly colonizing the field. Are you making the room smaller than it needs to be? Are you pushing when you should be pausing? Are you using words to dominate, rescue, silence, self-protect, or posture, rather than to tell the truth with enough room for reality to remain alive? This is where the ethical depth of conscious living becomes impossible to avoid. Because consciousness is not just private self-awareness. It is also participation. It is how you enter the worlds of others, and what your presence does when it gets there. So the core insight of this section is this. Conscious living includes responsibility for the world your language helps create. That applies inwardly and outwardly, to self-talk, to conflict, to care, to leadership, to an ordinary tone, to repeated stories, to the words you choose when you are tired, threatened, ashamed, or trying to stay present. Language is part of the architecture of awareness, and once that is understood, consciousness is no longer only about seeing clearly. It is also about speaking in ways that do less harm, create more reality, and leave people, including yourself, more accessible to truth. And once that is in view, another quality becomes essential: humility. Because without humility, consciousness itself can become a new identity project, a new superiority, a new subtle performance of being the one who sees. That is where we move next. Part 5. The role of humility and return. If conscious living includes responsibility for language, state, attention, and participation, then one quality becomes indispensable if the work is not to turn into another subtle performance: humility. That word can sound soft, moralistic, or overly religious in some contexts, but here it points to something practical and psychologically necessary. Humility is not self-belittlement. It is not pretending to be smaller than you are. It is not weakness, passivity, or the refusal to speak clearly. Humility is the willingness to remain honest about how shaped you still are. It is the refusal to turn awareness into superiority. It is the discipline of leaving the field open where certainty wants to close it too quickly. This matters because consciousness work can become distorted in a very specific way. A person begins to see more. They recognize patterns in themselves and others. They understand the role of attention, body state, language, subconscious sequencing, collective pressure, and relational fields. They begin noticing what was previously invisible, and that visibility can bring genuine relief. But unless humility grows alongside insight, the person may quietly convert awareness into identity. They become the one who knows, the one who sees, the one who is more conscious than the crowd, the one who has moved beyond ordinary conditioning, the one who reads the field better than others. And the moment that happens, awareness has already been bent back into unconsciousness again, because now consciousness is being used not as contact, but as self-positioning. This is one of the quiet dangers of any serious inner work. The ego does not only defend through ignorance, it also defends through refinement. It can become spiritual, psychological, philosophical, embodied, articulate, trauma-informed, perceptive, and still deeply attached to being the one who knows. A person may speak about nervous systems, identity, mirroring, language, and manipulation with impressive fluency, while remaining subtly protected from the deeper vulnerability of not knowing, of being wrong, of still being shaped, of still disappearing into old loops. In that sense, superiority is often less a sign of awareness than a defense against uncertainty, and uncertainty is precisely where humility becomes necessary. Because one of the clearest signs of maturing awareness is not how quickly a person concludes, but how willing they are to remain with partiality. They begin to understand that the state shapes perception. That attention can be captured. That old patterning can dress itself up as present truth. That emotional certainty is not always clarity. That collective fields can make the distortion feel obvious. That language can close the field before reality has fully arrived. Once a person really understands those things, they often become slower to claim finality. Not weaker, slower, more careful, less eager to collapse complexity into immediate judgment, less willing to turn the first interpretation into total truth. This is why humility keeps the field open. A humble consciousness can still speak clearly. It can still disagree. It can still draw boundaries, name manipulation, reject falseness, or challenge distortion. But it does so without needing to turn itself into a final authority. It remains more aware of its own conditions. It leaves room for the possibility that more is happening than the first frame suggests. It recognizes that every human perception arrives through layers: body, memory, attention, language, atmosphere, role, expectation, history. So instead of asking only, "What do I think?" the person begins asking, "What is shaping what I think right now?" That question is humility in practice. Certainty, by contrast, often closes the field. This does not mean certainty is always wrong. Some things are clear, some patterns deserve naming, some boundaries need firmness, some forms of incoherence or manipulation become obvious enough that pretending ambiguity would be dishonest. But psychologically, certainty often becomes dangerous when it is used too quickly, too globally, or too protectively. A person becomes certain not because reality has been carefully held, but because uncertainty itself feels intolerable. The certainty then acts as a regulation. It relieves tension. It restores self-coherence. It lets the person feel stable again. But that emotional relief can be mistaken for truth. This is why humility and regulation are connected. A regulated person can often tolerate not knowing for longer. They can remain with ambiguity without collapsing so quickly into a defensive conclusion. An unregulated person often needs certainty more urgently, because uncertainty feels like a threat. The field must be closed. The other person must be reduced. The meaning must be fixed. The body wants immediate orientation, and the mind supplies it. Humility interrupts that reflex by allowing contact to remain open a little longer. Conscious living, then, is not about becoming above others. It is about becoming less ruled by what shapes you unconsciously. That is a crucial distinction. Many people imagine awareness as ascent, becoming more elevated, more refined, more beyond ordinary people and their patterns. But a more mature view sees consciousness less as ascent and more as de-automation, less being ruled by urgency, less ruled by shame, less ruled by image, less ruled by inherited stories, less ruled by the need to dominate the field with explanation, less ruled by the identity of being the insightful one, less ruled by emotional weather masquerading as eternal truth. The movement is not toward becoming superior. It is toward becoming less unconsciously driven, and that movement often looks quieter than people expect. In fact, one of the most telling signs of maturing awareness is that it becomes less theatrical. The person may appear less grand, not more, less obsessed with proving their insight, less invested in being seen as awake, less interested in dramatic self-positioning, less likely to perform constant certainty, spiritual fluency, psychological sophistication, or moral clarity as identity. They may become more ordinary in some outward sense, but more honest inwardly, more careful, more precise, more able to admit "I don't know yet," more able to say "something in me is activated," more able to recognize "this feels true, but I need to stay with it longer," more able to return after a drift without turning the return itself into a performance. That last point matters. Return without drama is one of the clearest forms of humility. Many people make too much ceremony out of returning to awareness. They disappear into a pattern, then come back with heavy self-criticism, confession, self-analysis, or renewed identity around doing the work. But the deeper practice is often much simpler. You notice the drift, you notice the state, you notice the role, the tone, the story, the loss of contact, and you come back. Without self-punishment, without grand declarations, without needing to become interesting through your own struggle. You return because return is the practice. This matters because self-punishment is often just another way of staying self-absorbed. It looks like honesty, but it can really be a refusal to keep moving. A person becomes preoccupied with their own failure rather than re-entering contact. Humility allows a cleaner response. It says, yes, I drifted. Yes, I disappeared. Yes, I spoke from activation or turned the field into performance or surrendered attention or repeated the old story. Now return. Not because it does not matter, but because staying fused with the failure is just another form of unconsciousness. This is why the most mature consciousness is often quieter, humbler, and less performative than people expect. It does not always announce itself as special. It may actually become harder to detect from the outside because it is less interested in signaling itself. It is not trying to look wise. It is trying to remain in contact. It is not building identity around seeing. It is learning how not to abandon itself so quickly. It is less colonizing in conversation because it does not need to dominate the field with its own interpretation. It is less brittle because it does not require constant self-confirmation. It is more available to truth because it is less defended against being incomplete, and incompleteness is part of the point. A mature consciousness becomes more able to live without final closure. It sees that reality is often more layered than immediate judgment allows. It seems that the body, subconscious, and field all affect perception. It seems that even the desire to be conscious can become distorted into an image. It seems that one can speak intelligently about all of this and still lose contact in an instant under the right conditions. This recognition does not weaken the work, it deepens it, because now the work is no longer being done from fantasy, it is being done with honesty. So the role of humility and return is not peripheral to conscious living, it is central. Without humility, consciousness becomes identity. Without humility, insight becomes performance. Without humility, language becomes domination. Without humility, certainty closes the field before truth has had time to arrive. Without humility, the person begins using awareness to stand above life, rather than participate in it more honestly. Return protects against that. Return brings the person back down from performance into practice. Back from self-image into contact. Back from being the one who sees into being the one who is willing to keep seeing, again and again, without making an idol of the fact, and perhaps that is one of the clearest ways to say it. Humility keeps the field open. Certainty often closes it. Return reopens it. That is not a weakness. It is maturity. Because a conscious life is not built by becoming untouchable, superior, or permanently enlightened. It is built by becoming less ruled by what shapes you unconsciously, more honest about when you drift, and more willing to return without spectacle. Once that is understood, the next question becomes deeply practical and beautifully ordinary. What does a conscious life actually look like? Not in theory, not in ideal form, and not as an image, but in daily life, in real behavior, in the way a person moves through ordinary moments. That is where we move next. Part 6. What a conscious life actually looks like after exploring the body, the subconscious, attention, language, identity, influence, mirroring, collective states, and the discipline of return. There is a natural temptation to imagine that a conscious life must look unusual from the outside. More composed, more spiritually luminous, more psychologically perfected, more visibly advanced, more obviously wise. But one of the most important things to say at this stage of the episode is that conscious living is often much less dramatic than people imagine. From the outside, it may look ordinary. In fact, it often becomes more ordinary, because nothing changes, but because the change is happening in the structure of participation, rather than in the performance of identity. The person may still go to work, answer messages, raise children, have difficult conversations, get tired, feel overwhelmed, lose contact, and need to return. They may still experience frustration, fear, shame, confusion, longing, irritation, grief, or conflict. They may still make mistakes, still repeat patterns, still misread situations, still get activated, still need to apologize, still have blind spots. A conscious life does not remove the ordinary conditions of being human. What it changes is the way those conditions are inhabited. That is why it helps to make this section concrete and demystifying. Because many people have abstract admiration for awareness, without being able to recognize what it actually looks like in practice. They imagine consciousness as a kind of permanent energetic clarity or elevated identity. But more often, a conscious life reveals itself in small moments that alter the entire quality of participation. A conscious life may look like pausing before reacting. That pause can be very brief. It may last only a few seconds. But those seconds matter because they interrupt the speed at which the old sequence normally completes itself. Something happens. The body reacts. The familiar interpretation begins forming. Emotion starts organizing the field. And instead of obeying the first momentum completely, the person pauses. They do not always pause perfectly. They do not always choose well. But the pause exists. That is significant because without it, much of life becomes pure sequencing. With it, another possibility enters the room. A conscious life may look like noticing activation sooner. This, too, is more practical than dramatic. The person notices their jaw tightening before the argument has fully taken over. They feel the breath shorten before they call their urgency clarity. They sense the body leaving the room before their words become flat or performative. They notice when irritation is beginning to organize perception. They catch the bodily shift earlier than they used to. This does not mean they never get activated. It means activation does not always become invisible until after damage is done. Earlier recognition changes what becomes possible. A conscious life may look like telling the truth more accurately. Not more brutally, not more self-righteously, more accurately. This means using language that reflects reality rather than simply discharging the state. Instead of "you never listen," perhaps, "I don't feel received right now." Instead of "everything is collapsing," perhaps, "I am overwhelmed and losing perspective." Instead of "I'm broken," perhaps, "something old in me is activated and shaping this moment." Accurate language matters because words do not merely describe the field. They help create it. Conscious living often means becoming more careful with naming. Not because language must become sterile, but because the person increasingly understands that distortion has consequences. A conscious life may look like feeling the body before the story completes itself. This is one of the most powerful shifts in the whole process. Most people live as though the story arrives first and the body merely follows. But once awareness deepens, the person begins to notice that the body often speaks earlier. The stomach drops, the chest tightens, the shoulders rise, the energy collapses, the breath changes, the heat comes, the numbness enters. If this is noticed before the story has hardened completely, the relationship to the moment changes. The person realizes, something in me is already moving. That awareness may not stop the story entirely, but it creates room between sensation and conclusion. A conscious life may look like stepping out of old roles. This can be one of the quietest but most profound signs of change. The person no longer automatically becomes the appeaser in every difficult exchange, or the explainer, or the rescuer, or the self-erasing one, or the cold one, or the hyper-competent one, or the one who performs understanding while losing contact. The old role may still appear, the pull may still be strong, but there comes a moment when the person recognizes it as a role rather than an essence. They begin to see that they are about to become someone familiar, and sometimes they do not go all the way in. That partial refusal changes a great deal. A conscious life may look like protecting attention. This does not always look impressive. Often it looks like saying no to unnecessary input, not checking immediately, not handing the first hour of the day over to external capture, not feeding every symbolic conflict, not allowing outrage, noise, and repetition to colonize the field by default, not treating every prompt as a command. Attention protection can look deeply ordinary, but in a world built to fragment awareness, it becomes one of the clearest signs that a person is beginning to take consciousness seriously as something that requires stewardship. A conscious life may look like being careful with language, not timid, careful. The person begins to sense that tone matters. Those words enter bodies. That timing changes the field. That repeated self-description becomes identity architecture. That contempt is not harmless. That a phrase spoken from activation can colonize a room for hours. That exaggeration narrows reality. That precision can be regulated. This does not make the person perfect in speech. It makes them less careless, less likely to use words as weapons while pretending they are simply being honest, less likely to say things they know the nervous system will experience as collapse, shame, or totality, when reality is more nuanced than that. A conscious life may look like allowing uncertainty. This is one of the less glamorous features of awareness, but one of the most mature. The person becomes slower to claim total interpretation, less eager to conclude instantly, less attached to the first explanation that relieves tension, more willing to say, "I don't know yet," more willing to let a feeling be real without immediately turning it into a final truth, more willing to leave room for the possibility that the state is shaping perception. In practical terms, this often looks like less certainty, not more. But that less certainty is not confusion, it is spaciousness. A conscious life may look like returning after drift without theatrics. This is one of the clearest markers of real practice. The person disappears into a loop, a role, a day of fragmentation, an argument, a story, a reactive sequence, an old pattern. Then they notice, and instead of building a new drama around having failed, they return. They re-enter the body, re-enter the field, re-enter truthfulness, re-enter the conversation, re-enter the practice. No grand identity project, no self-punishment ritual, no performance of how aware they are of having become unaware. Just return. That kind of simplicity is often a sign that the work has become real. A conscious life may look like becoming easier to be around because your field is less colonizing. This matters more than people often realize. Some people are difficult to be around, not because they are malicious, but because their nervous system, language, certainty, urgency, self-focus, or emotional field takes up too much space. They colonize the room. Others must orient around them. Their intensity becomes the shared environment. As consciousness deepens, this often changes. The person may become less dominating without becoming less clear, less reactive without becoming deadened, less controlling of meaning, less demanding than others stabilize their self-coherence. Easier to speak honestly with, easier to breathe around, easier to stay oneself around. This is a deeply practical measure of consciousness, not whether a person sounds advanced, but whether others can remain more in contact with themselves in that person's presence. And all of this needs to be said alongside an equally important clarification. Conscious living does not mean never being triggered. Triggers do not disappear simply because a person becomes more aware. The body still has memory. The subconscious still has patterning. The field still exerts pressure. A person may become more literate in their triggers, may notice them earlier, may move through them with less total fusion, but the existence of activation is not proof that consciousness has failed. It is proof that the organism remains human. Conscious living also does not mean always being calm. There are forms of false calm that are less conscious than open, truthful distress. A person can be flat, dissociated, emotionally absent, or spiritually performative, and look calm from the outside. Meanwhile, another person may be visibly feeling a lot, but remaining more honest, more embodied, and more in contact with reality. Calm is not the measure. Contact is. It does not mean never repeating patterns. Patterns return. That is part of the work. The difference is that the person begins seeing them sooner, inhabiting them less innocently, and recovering from them with greater honesty. Repetition does not invalidate awareness. Unseen repetition is the deeper issue. It does not mean having superior perception. One of the dangers of consciousness work is that people begin to imagine themselves as the one who sees more clearly than everyone else. Sometimes they do see certain patterns more readily, but superiority is often a sign that awareness has already become identity. A mature consciousness tends to become more humble about perception, not more inflated. It knows too well how many layers condition what looks obvious, and it certainly does not mean becoming spiritually impressive. In fact, conscious living may make a person less impressive in the performative sense, less interested in image, less interested in being the awakened one, less invested in displaying coherence instead of practicing it, less grand, more grounded, less theatrical, more honest. From the outside, this may look ordinary. From the inside, it is deeply different. That is perhaps the central insight of this whole section. A conscious life often looks ordinary from the outside, but deeply different from the inside. The difference is not always visible in status, charisma, or language alone. It shows in participation, whether the person can feel the body before the story hardens, whether they can protect attention, whether they can speak more accurately, whether they can step out of an old role, whether they can allow uncertainty, whether they can return without collapse, whether they can create less distortion in the field around them, whether they live with more contact than they used to. That kind of life may not always be admired by others, or within the systems and architectures we live within that reward performance, speed, certainty, and spectacle. But it is often more real, and perhaps that is what makes it worth pursuing. Not because it makes a person special, but because it makes a person more honest in the life they are already living. Once that becomes visible, the next step is to bridge the ideal and practice more gently still. Because even when conscious living has been demystified, many people still struggle with consistency. They can glimpse the life, but not yet sustain the rhythm. That is where we move next. The discipline of consistency without rigidity. Part 7. The discipline of consistency without rigidity. If the previous section made conscious living more concrete, this part closes the gap between ideal and practice. Because many people can now recognize what a more conscious life looks like, but still quietly wonder how such a life is sustained without turning it into another performance, another self-management project, or another impossible standard. This is where consistency matters. Not intensity, not inspiration, not occasional dramatic breakthroughs followed by long stretches of forgetfulness. Consistency. A conscious life is usually built through rhythm, ritual, and repeated return far more than through exceptional states. Rhythm matters because human beings forget. They drift. They get captured. They get tired. They get recruited by fields, devices, emotions, and old roles. So if awareness is left entirely to mood, it becomes sporadic. If it is held only through inspiration, it becomes fragile. But when a life begins to include repeated structures of return, awareness becomes easier to recover. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity can feel powerful. A person may have an extraordinary day of insight, a deep emotional release, a clear conversation, a spiritually vivid moment, or a sudden period of strong motivation. All of that has value. But intensity does not necessarily stabilize consciousness. It often burns brightly and then recedes. Consistency is quieter. It asks less for dramatic transformation and more for repetition. Less for one great moment and more for many small, honest returns. And that is where discipline must be distinguished from severity. Severity says, get it right, maintain the state, don't drift, don't fail, don't forget, don't be human. Discipline says, return, build conditions that help you remember, notice when awareness has gone thin, re-enter without punishment. Keep the practice close enough to life that it can actually be lived. This is why rigid self-management usually fails. A person becomes too controlling, too idealized, too self-monitoring, too invested in maintaining an image of awareness, rather than supporting the actual conditions that make awareness more available. They become brittle, practice loses warmth, the body begins to experience consciousness itself as pressure. Then the whole thing becomes unsustainable. A mature discipline works differently. It builds a life that supports remembrance. That may begin with very simple rhythms. Morning moments of return are one example. Not starting the day inside immediate external capture. Taking even a minute or two to feel the body, Notice the breath, orient to the room, and recognize the state you are waking into before the world begins organizing you. That small act changes the tone of the day. It says, awareness enters first, not urgency. Body check-ins matter for similar reasons. A few honest pauses through the day. What state am I in? What is my breath doing? Has my jaw hardened? Have I left the room internally? Am I speeding up, going flat, becoming performative? These check-ins are not dramatic, but they interrupt unconscious continuity. Attention boundaries matter too. A conscious life is much harder to build when attention is constantly surrendered. So discipline may mean protecting the field, reducing unnecessary input, not handing every idle moment to the device, being more selective about what gets access to the mind, and recognizing which environments reliably fragment awareness. This is not withdrawal from reality. It is stewardship. Pre-conversation orientation is another simple but powerful practice. Before entering a difficult conversation, a meeting, a family interaction, or a charged environment, taking a moment to orient can change the quality of participation. Feel the body, notice the room, slow the pace slightly, recognize the state you are carrying in. This does not guarantee wisdom, but it makes contact more available. Regular reflective practice helps as well. That may be writing, walking, sitting in silence, speaking honestly with someone trustworthy, or simply reviewing the day without self-punishment. Where did I lose contact? What field shaped me? What role came online? What helped me return? Reflection stabilizes memory. It keeps experience from dissolving into a blur. And relationship choices matter. Some relationships support self-contact. Others repeatedly narrow it. Conscious living includes becoming more honest about which fields make return easier and which keep recruiting old disappearances. This is not about blaming others for your whole consciousness. It is about recognizing that the environments you repeatedly enter matter. All of this leads to one central insight. Discipline is not severity. It is structured remembering. It is the building of rhythms that helps awareness come back before life is fully handed over to automation. It is choosing practices that are sustainable rather than theatrical, human rather than idealized, close to daily life rather than dependent on rare moods. That is how conscious living becomes something real enough to last. Part 8, the final philosophy. Return over perfection. If this series has been moving toward anything, it has been moving toward a quieter philosophy than many people expect. Not climax, not transcendence in the theatrical sense, not the fantasy of becoming permanently awake, permanently calm, permanently clear, permanently beyond drift, beyond influence, beyond reaction, beyond memory, beyond the body, beyond the ordinary vulnerability of being human. Something quieter, and in the end, something more demanding. Because the final philosophy of this series is not perfection, it is a return. That matters because much of the suffering people create around consciousness work comes not only from unconscious living itself, but from what they imagine awareness is supposed to become. They secretly turn it into an ideal state, a final condition, a purified version of self, a permanent upgrade, a proof that they have now moved beyond the old loops for good. Then ordinary life returns, as it always does. Fatigue returns, pressure returns, the body tightens. The field gets crowded, the story reappears, attention is captured, emotion narrows perception, old roles begin knocking again. And what should have been recognized as part of the human rhythm is instead interpreted as failure. But the aim is not perfection. Perfection is too brittle for a living consciousness. It cannot survive contact with real life. It turns awareness into performance. It makes the person monitor themselves constantly, not to stay in truth, but to maintain an image of coherence. It pushes them towards self-management rather than self-contact. It encourages shame when the body does what bodies do, when the subconscious does what subconscious patterning does, when attention drifts as attention drifts, when the field shapes them more than they wanted to admit. Perfection closes the field around a fantasy that no actual human organism can inhabit for long. This is why perfection is not only impossible, it is often unconscious. It makes honesty harder. It rewards appearance over reality. It creates pressure to look awake rather than to keep returning when awareness is lost. It invites identity to attach itself to consciousness as a badge, rather than allowing consciousness to remain a living, fluctuating relationship with truth. A person trying to be perfect often becomes less able to admit when they are frightened, dysregulated, resentful, dependent on certainty, or subtly performing insight. Their self-image becomes too invested, and once the self-image is too invested, awareness is already compromised. So the aim is not perfection, and the aim is not permanent awakening. That fantasy has many forms. Sometimes it looks spiritual, sometimes psychological, sometimes philosophical, sometimes therapeutic. But the shape is similar. One day, the person will finally arrive. They will remain in contact at all times. They will no longer disappear into reactivity. They will not be overtaken by old emotion. They will not be destabilized by language, relationships, collective fields, or bodily shifts. They will become someone for whom consciousness is simply on, continuously, without interruption. But our awareness does not work that way. Consciousness moves. It is state-dependent. It narrows and widens. It fragments and regathers. It is shaped by sleep, nourishment, pressure, grief, conflict, meaning, social atmosphere, hormonal shifts, unresolved memory, cultural tension, and the countless invisible influences that form the ecology of a life. Even a deeply reflective person still drifts. Even a disciplined person still gets recruited. Even someone with extraordinary insight can still be taken by surprise by the body, the field, the story, the tone, the timing, the return of a very old emotional sequence. This is not proof that awareness is weakness. It is proof that awareness is alive. A permanent awakening would imply a condition no longer in a real relationship with a changing context. But the human being is always in context, always in a body, always in some field, always in some degree of relationship with internal and external shaping forces. What changes with practice is not that all of this disappears. What changes is that the person becomes more able to recognize it, more able to return from it, more able to remain in contact with themselves while it happens, and less likely to be unconsciously ruled by it for as long. So the aim is not permanent awakening, and the aim is not immunity from influence. This is another subtle fantasy that appears in consciousness work. A person begins to understand language, manipulation, attention capture, ideology, emotional contagion, mirroring, collective states, and subconscious patterning. They then imagine that the mature self will become invulnerable to all of it. They will see through everything. They will no longer be recruited by social fields. They will not be moved by pressure. They will not be touched by the emotional weather of others. They will not be influenced by language unless they consciously permit it. They will become impermeable, but that is not maturity. That is often armoring. We are influenced creatures. We are relational, embodied, impressionable, social, linguistic, effective, and field responsive. We do not cease to be shaped because we become more aware of shaping. We become more literate within it. We become less naive, perhaps, less easily captured, less likely to surrender our own reference point immediately, more able to notice what is happening and ask better questions. But we do not become immune. That is important because the fantasy of immunity often creates more unconsciousness, not less. It leads to overconfidence. It produces contempt for others. It invites the person to underestimate the subtlety of the field. It makes them less humble about the body, less aware of the conditions under which they themselves become recruited, and less honest about how much influence can still enter through exhaustion, grief, hope, longing, loneliness, shame, admiration, urgency, belonging, or fear. The conscious path is not immunity from influence. It is wiser participation within influence. It is the capacity to ask, what is shaping me right now? What is this language doing? What has my attention? What field am I in? What state is my body in? What does this message want from me? What story is this activating? What part of me is responding? And how much of that response belongs to the present? That is not immunity. It is literacy, and the aim is not to become someone else. This too needs to be said clearly. Many people approach consciousness work as a project of self-replacement. They dislike who they are when they drift, react, freeze, appease, spiral, over-explain, shut down, or lose contact. So they imagine awareness as a way to become a different kind of being altogether, calmer, cleaner, wiser, more elevated, more elegant, more beyond the mess. But the mature path is not self-replacement. It is a deeper relationship. The person does not become someone else. They become more able to remain with themselves honestly, more able to recognize what is patterned and what is alive, more able to feel where the body is constricting, where the old identity is speaking, where the role is taking over, where the language is colonizing the field, where the nervous system is narrowing perception, where attention has gone thin. They do not transcend being human. They become more intimate with the actual conditions of being human. That often includes compassion, but not the sentimental kind that excuses everything. A more disciplined compassion, one that sees how patterns formed, how they are reinforced, what they cost, and what repeated returns are needed if they are to loosen. It says, this is mine to work with, not because it is all my fault, but because it is here. It is in my body, my language, my timing, my stories, my fields, my habits of attention. And if consciousness is to become lived rather than admired, I must remain in relationship with these things as they actually are. So if the aim is not perfection, not permanent awakening, not immunity from influence, and not becoming someone else, what is the aim? The aim is to return, again and again, return to body, return to awareness, return to truthfulness, return to internal reference, return to the present. Return to the body means coming back to the place where the state becomes readable. Feeling the breath, the jaw, the chest, the stomach, the feet, the pace, the contraction, the widening. The subtle signs that the whole system has already started moving before the story claims it is simply thinking. Return to body means refusing the fantasy that consciousness happens somewhere above the neck, untouched by physiology. It means beginning where reality is already speaking. Return to awareness means noticing when you have left, when the field has swallowed you, when the story has hardened, when the role has been taken over, when urgency has become interpretation, when certainty has closed the room, when you are speaking from activation, scrolling from emptiness, obeying a familiar sequence, or disappearing into a crowd state without realizing it. Awareness is not a permanent possession. It is often a rediscovered one. Return to truthfulness means naming what is actually happening with greater accuracy. Not the dramatic version, not the flattering version, not the punishing version, the truer version. I am activated. I am making this more total than it is. I am trying to control the field. I am drifting. I am more tired than I admitted. I want certainty because I feel unsafe. This feels real, but it may be shaped by older patterning. Truthfulness keeps the work grounded. It prevents consciousness from becoming mythology. Return to internal reference means coming back to the place in you that can still feel what is yours before the crowd, the device, the ideology, the relationship, the role, or the pressure tells you what to think, what to say, what to fear, what to perform. It means not abandoning your own perception too quickly. Not because you are infallible, but because losing internal reference is one of the main ways human beings become governable by whatever field is strongest around them. Return to the present means exactly what it sounds like, though it is often harder than it appears. The present is not merely a spiritual slogan, it is where actual information exists. Not just memory, not just projection, not only the old role, not only the imagined future, not only the inherited script. The present includes the room, the body, the person in front of you, the actual sentence spoken, the actual tone, the actual capacity, the actual limit, and the actual state. Returning to the present is often what breaks the momentum of unconscious sequence, because the present is almost always larger than the loop that was about to define it. This is why repeated return is the mature form of conscious living. Not one great return, not one permanent opening, repeated return. Because repeated return respects the fact that consciousness is dynamic. It respects that human beings are layered. It respects that forgetting happens, capture happens, emotional narrowing happens, social shaping happens, and drift happens. It does not build a philosophy that requires the impossible. It builds a practice that remains viable within the real. There is something profoundly dignified in that. A person who keeps returning may not always look extraordinary. They may still appear quite ordinary from the outside. But inwardly, something very different is taking place. They are becoming less automatic, less colonized by the first frame, less ruled by the old story, less innocent about their own certainty, less careless with attention, less likely to use language without feeling its consequences, less likely to abandon themselves for as long. That is not perfection. It is stewardship, and perhaps that is the final philosophy in its simplest form. You will drift. Return. You will tighten. Return. You will be captured. Return. You will mistake state for truth. Return. You will repeat a role. Return. You will feel certain too quickly. Return. You will disappear into the field. Return. You will forget. Return. Again and again. Not because the return is glamorous, but because the return is life. That is the mature form of conscious living. Not arrival, not immunity, not an image. Return. Once that is understood, the whole series begins to close in the right spirit. Not with pressure to become extraordinary, but with responsibility to keep returning, honestly, imperfectly, and in real time, to the body, the field, the language, the truth, and the moment in which consciousness is always being asked to participate again. Thank you for joining me throughout this series. Until we meet again, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 20, The Discipline of Conscious Living. I'm James Miller.